Japan's position completely matches that of the United States. North Korea's missile launch poses a serious and grave threat on an unprecedented level. I am in complete agreement with President Trump that we must convene an emergency UN meeting and increase pressure on North Korea.
Well, joining us from Washington is Bruce Klingner, former CIA Deputy Division Chief for Korea and a senior research fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. Bruce, you're the person to talk to. What options are on the table?
Well, when President Trump says military options on the table, some will jump to think that it'll be a preventative attack. I don't think so. I think we've walked back from what had been perceived as moving towards some kind of military option. I think instead the U.S. is going to try to lead the charge on yet more pressure on North Korea. Contrary to popular misperception, there is a lot more that can be done internationally, as well as the U.S. can do unilaterally using its own laws.
Bruce, what can they do? What are those options then?
Well, in the UN, we've seen in the last year moving more towards Iran-like pressure, where we move beyond targeted financial measures, targeted specifically at violators of UN resolutions, more towards broader economic pressure, such as in North Korea's case, capping and then banning the sale of key resources such as coal. They could go towards an embargo of oil sales to North Korea. That would be a big step moving forward to pressure it. But with UN options, or UN sanctions, it's always a question of how strongly China will actually implement them. The U.S. can use its own laws because the vast majority of all international transactions are denominated in dollars, which means they go through U.S. banks, and actually we can increase pressure on China and the North Korea.
Well, Iran is rather different, Bruce, and you touched on why. It's China. Therefore, is the UN even a route that you can explore, given China's reluctance to really explore the kind of things that you're talking about, at least so far?
Well, what we've seen with the UN resolutions is incremental steps forward. Each one is better than the one before. Of course, we could have been to where we are now a lot earlier had China not been obstructionist. But China is increasingly angry with its ally, and so it allows, again, incrementally stronger measures against North Korea. The U.S. has begun to pressure and sanction some of the Chinese violators of U.S. law. We saw some recently against Chinese and Russian, but we can do more. So far, the U.S. hasn't imposed any fines on any Chinese bank, in contrast with $12 billion in fines we imposed on European banks for money laundering for Iran.
Is that really the way to get China on board, though?
Well, I think what we need to do is distinguish between diplomacy and law enforcement. We've been holding back on enforcing our own laws. Giving Chinese violators, Chinese criminals, de facto immunity from U.S. law certainly hasn't worked. So we can tell China, as Secretary Mnuchin has done before, look, we're not saying China is complicit in this illicit activity. It certainly knows about it, but we're going to enforce our laws. We're not going to back away from enforcing our laws simply because the criminals are Chinese.
Bruce, I'm trying to work out this morning through our guests whether we've reached that inflection point that we weren't at several decades ago when other presidents had to deal with what's in front of them in the Korean Peninsula. The idea that if you wait, it's okay because they don't have the nuclear capability. Is waiting even an option now?
Well, a preventative attack, which some are advocating, really is a case of starting a war to prevent a war. When I was back in government, we would do war games and tabletop exercises in North Korean scenarios. The Allies always won, but it was at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties, and that's before we thought North Korea had nuclear weapons. So you have 25 million people in Seoul, 35 million people in Tokyo. Both those are already within range of nuclear-tipped missiles.
What we saw work just a few weeks ago was President Trump's rhetoric was very extreme, fury and fire, right? And that gave China sort of a negotiating bargain when it came to North Korea. Are we going to have to see more strong rhetoric out of President Trump for Kim Jong-un to really change his perspective a bit?
Well, some would argue that the president's tweets and comments, created a fear in North Korea and China. It led Beijing to increase pressure or allow greater pressure on Pyongyang. On the other hand, others were more nervous, including our allies, South Korea, Japan, were uncertain how far the president would go. They didn't know if they would be dragged into a conflict between the U.S. and North Korea. So the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, even said he has a veto, in essence, reticence over North Korea or U.S. actions against North Korea. He says the U.S. has promised that there would be consultations and a need for South Korean approval before we did a U.S. action. So concern or negotiating leverage, we can debate that.
Hey, Bruce, really appreciate your time. Hopefully we'll catch up with you again soon. Bruce Klingner, of course, of the Heritage Foundation. In the markets, risk off and havens bid. That's the story. In the Treasury market, it means one thing: yields make new lows for